I have told this story only once before to the welfare advocate Len Durath in the visiting room of the Veth Municipal Detention Block, through a wire partition that smelled of disinfectant and old metal. She wrote it down in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. I do not know what she did with the notebook. I do not know, even now, whether what I started was enough. I know what it cost. I decided some time ago that the cost was not the point. The point was the 12 days. The point was what I did inside them. My name is Tomas Vrel. For 31 years I was a transit registrar for the Veth Colonial Port Authority, subdivision of interspecies documentation. That is a very long title for a very modest job. What it meant in practice was that I sat behind a counter made of pale colonial wood, in an office that smelled of paper and the particular damp that comes off the harbor in the early morning, and I processed transit forms, entry permits, residency declarations, welfare registrations, cargo manifests with living cargo. I stamped things. I filed things in the archive room behind my desk, a long, narrow room lined floor to ceiling with gray document shelves, lit by two overhead panels that had been flickering since the year I arrived, and that nobody had ever come to fix. I was not a soldier. I was not a ranger or a marshal or anything that carries a weapon. I had a stamp, a filing code, and a detailed working knowledge of the intercolonial compact's procedural annexes. That was the full extent of my arsenal, and for 31 years it was sufficient. I want you to understand that, because what I did was not brave in any way that word is usually meant. Brave suggests a moment of decision, a clarity, a choice made in full knowledge of the stakes. I did not have that. I had a Tuesday morning, a cup of bad tea that had gone cold on my desk, and a small pale child crouched behind the third shelf of the archive room holding a document folder over her head like it might shield her from something. That was how it began. The rain had started before dawn. I remember because I had walked to the office along Karathveth's lower cobblestone district, past the spice merchants who were already up and laying their tarps, and the stones were slick and dark, and the harbor smell was strong, that particular combination of salt and engine oil, and the faint chemical sweetness that comes off the intersystem freighters when they vent their coolant lines. I liked that smell. After 31 years, I liked most things about the morning walk. It was the part of the day that was entirely mine. I arrived at the office at the 6th hour, as I always did. I hung my coat on the hook behind the door. I made tea on the small burner on the back shelf, which I was technically not supposed to have in a paper archive, but which had been there so long it had become invisible to inspectors. I sat down at my desk and opened the intake ledger for the day. At the 7th hour, I went into the archive room to pull the previous quarter's residency renewal batch for cross-indexing. The archive room was cold, as it always was in the wet season, and the two overhead panels were doing their usual uncertain flickering. I was on the second shelf, third section, looking for the Orvath species renewal batch, when I heard something breathe. I am not a man who startles easily. 31 years behind a transit counter teaches you to take new information calmly and work out what to do with it. I set the folder I was holding back on the shelf. I took 2 steps toward the sound. She was behind the third shelf, pressed into the angle where the shelf unit met the back wall, her knees drawn up, and a document folder held in both hands in front of her face. She was small, very small, pale as ash, the kind of pale that is its own color rather than the absence of one, with markings along her jaw and down the sides of her neck that in the dim flickering light looked like threads of blue-silver drawn just under the skin. Her eyes, when she lowered the folder and looked at me, were pale green, very wide and entirely without the blurred softness of sleep. She had been awake a long time. Her hair was dark, cropped close to her skull, and she was wearing a tunic that was too large for her and boots that were worn through at the left toe. She was Verath. I knew the species from the transit forms. The jorage markings, the pale coloration, the particular shape of the ears, small and pointed, set slightly higher on the skull than human ears. I had processed perhaps 40 Verath transit documents in my career. They were not a common species on the colonial port routes. They kept to themselves. I looked at her, she looked at me. She did not run. I took that as a reasonable sign. "You've been in here all night," I said. She said nothing. "Are you hurt?" Still nothing. Her grip on the document folder tightened slightly. "I'm going to get you a cup of water," I said. "I'll leave the door open so you can see me the whole time. All right." I did not wait for permission. I went to the back shelf, poured water into one of the mugs I kept there, and brought it back and set it on the floor at the entrance to the archive room, within her line of sight but not close enough to crowd her. Then I went back to my desk and sat down and opened the intake ledger again. It took about 4 minutes. Then I heard small boots on the floor and the sound of her picking up the mug. I did not look up. After another few minutes I said, without raising my eyes from the ledger, "I won't ask you how you got in. The latch on the side window has been loose for 8 years and nobody's fixed it. I've reported it 3 times. A pause, then quietly in accented but clear colonial standard, "You are not going to report me." It was not a question, exactly. It was somewhere between a question and a test of something. "Not until I understand the situation," I said. "That's my standard procedure." Another pause. "You are a registrar." Tomas Vrel, 31 years, subdivision of interspecies documentation. "You process transit forms." "Among other things." She came to stand in the doorway of the archive room. The mug was empty. She held it with both hands the way children hold things when they are trying to look like they are not frightened. "My name is Saya," she said. "Pleased to meet you, Saya," I said. I pulled a standard individual intake form from the left drawer of my desk, uncapped my pen and wrote her name in the top field. "Sit down if you like. I'll need to ask you a few questions." She looked at the chair across from my desk. She looked at the intake form. Then she sat down. I asked her what I always asked: species, point of origin, current legal status, purpose of visit to Vethkarath. She answered the first 3. For the 4th she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the careful flat tone of someone choosing their words very precisely, "I came here because the delegation is here, and because they cannot take me from a colonial authority building without filing the proper notice first, and because I needed time." I wrote that down in my own shorthand in the margin of the form, which I was not supposed to do, but which I had been doing for 31 years without incident. "The delegation," I said. "The Varath Conclave's retrieval delegation." She looked at me. "You know about it." "I saw a notification in last week's interspecies dispatch. A conclave delegation was scheduled to arrive in Vethkarath this week. I didn't know what they were retrieving." I looked at her across the desk. "What are you to them, Saya, in their terms?" She set the empty mug on the edge of my desk with a small, careful click. "Kethvoral," she said. I knew the term from the species documentation database I was required to maintain. It translated approximately as source form. It was a category within Varath species law designating individuals whose genetic pattern was considered to carry a structural function for the species as a whole, not a royal designation, not a spiritual one, but a biological legal one. A Kethvoral's genetic line was, in Varath law, communal property. Their reproductive and biological status was managed by the conclave, not by themselves. I had never processed a Kethvoral transit document before. I had never expected to. "How old are you?" I said. She told me. I wrote it down. "All right," I said. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay in the archive room for now. I'm going to complete this intake form and file it under active individual welfare assessment, which means this office has legal custody of your welfare status until the assessment is concluded. Under Intercolonial Compact Article 44, no retrieval action can be processed against an individual under active welfare assessment without a 72-hour review period. That gives us 3 days. She looked at me with those pale green eyes that had been awake all night. You know the compact. I've been filing documents under it for 31 years, I said. I know where every procedural door is. They will come here. Yes, they will file a reclamation notice this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest. When they do, I'll process it according to the standard timeline. I capped my pen and looked at her directly. I want to be clear with you, Saya. I am a transit registrar. I cannot stop the delegation by force. I cannot hide you indefinitely. What I can do is make this process take as long as the process is legally permitted to take. In that time, I intend to make some inquiries. What kind of inquiries? The kind that might build a longer wall than 3 days. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, why? I thought about that. I had been thinking about it since the moment she said Keth Vorel, and I had understood what it meant. Not a Verath religious term, not a title, but a legal category that erased the word child and replaced it with something owned. Because you are a child, I said, and in this office that means something. She did not cry. I had not expected her to. What she did was look at me for a long moment with the particular attention of someone who is deciding whether a thing is true or whether they are being managed. Then she nodded once and went back into the archive room, and I heard her settle onto the floor behind the third shelf, which was, I gathered, where she had decided she was safe. I picked up my pen and began making calls. The conclave's retrieval delegation filed their notice at the 14th hour that same day. There were 3 of them. 2 were retrieval officers in the dark gray uniform of the conclave's administrative arm, tall, formal, carrying document cases. The 3rd was an interspecies liaison appointed by the Veth Karath colonial government to facilitate, which is to say to smooth the path for whatever the delegation needed. His name was Garrett Oswin, and he had been in that liaison role for 6 years, and he was very good at facilitating and very uncomfortable with the moments when facilitation ran into something it couldn't accommodate. He looked uncomfortable when I told him the archive room was under active individual welfare assessment. Tomas, he said, in the tone of a man who wanted very badly to be reasonable and was not sure he was going to be allowed to. You filed that assessment this morning. I did. Before the delegation arrived. The assessment was triggered by an intake conducted this morning, yes. The timeline is documented. He looked at the intake form I had given him. He looked at the delegation's 2 retrieval officers, who were looking at me with the polite, impersonal attention of people who were not accustomed to hearing the word no delivered through paper. Article 44 specifies 72 hours from the time of the initial reclamation notice, the senior retrieval officer said. Her colonial standard was precise and flat. We have filed the notice. The clock begins now. Article 44 specifies 72 hours from the time of the initial welfare assessment for the individual in question, I said, which was filed at the 8th hour this morning, which predates your notice by 6 hours. The review period expires at the 8th hour 3 days from today. I placed the stamped copy of my own filing on the counter between us. I'll have the welfare review documentation ready for your representative at that time. Oswin looked at the stamped filing. He looked at the delegation. He looked at me. Tomas, he said. Garrett, I said. He took the delegation to the side room to discuss the procedural situation. I went back to my desk, made a fresh cup of tea, and began writing the welfare review documentation that would take up all of the next 3 days. What I wrote was careful and thorough and meticulously cross-referenced to every relevant annex of the intercolonial compact. I wrote about the condition in which the individual had been found. I wrote about the circumstances of her arrival in Veth Karath colonial territory. I wrote about the Keth Vorel classification under Verath law and the question, which I phrased as a question requiring further legal analysis rather than a conclusion, of whether a species internal legal category carried standing under colonial civil law, in a situation where the classified individual was physically present in colonial territory and had invoked the standard intake protections afforded to all individuals regardless of species. I wrote that the question required referral to the Colonial Legal Affairs Division, and that I had so referred it, which I then did, by standard form, which I filed before the end of the 14th hour. I also quietly sent a message to Len Durath. Len was a species welfare advocate. She worked for a small non-governmental organization that handled welfare disputes for non-human species in the colonial port system. Not a powerful organization, not a well-funded one, but a legally recognized one, which was the only kind of recognition that mattered for my purposes. I had filed intake forms that referenced her organization 3 times in the previous 5 years. I had never met her in person. I sent her the bare facts. 1 individual Verath Keth Voral classification under conclave law, currently under welfare assessment in my office, conclave retrieval delegation in city, 72-hour review window open. I asked whether her organization had any relevant legal precedent. I asked her to move quickly. Then I went into the archive room and told Saya she had 3 days for certain and that I was working on more. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the 3rd shelf with a stack of transit form blanks she had pulled from the lower drawer of the shelf unit. She was sorting them by date code. It was meticulous and entirely unnecessary work, and she was doing it with the focused attention of someone who needed to be doing something with her hands. "You're very organized," I said. "The conclave runs on documentation," she said, without looking up. "I learned to read document systems before I could walk." I thought about what that meant, a childhood structured entirely around what the conclave needed from her, her time and attention, and eventually her biology managed and directed toward their purposes, her life understood from birth as a function rather than a person. "Is there family," I said, "outside the conclave?" She set a form on the sorted stack. "My mother is conclave affiliated. My father's line is unregistered. That's partly why I carry the Keth Voral pattern, a combination from both lines. The conclave considers unregistered lines unmanaged. They prefer to manage." A pause. "There is an aunt, my father's sister. She lives outside conclave territory." "Where?" She looked up at me then, and there was something in her face that was not quite hope and not quite calculation, but something between the two. The look of someone who has been very careful about what to say for a very long time and is deciding whether this is a place where care can be relaxed slightly for a moment. "The Outer Reach," she said. "A settlement called Davorath on the 3rd Transit Corridor." I went back to my desk and added the ant settlement to the welfare review documentation under the heading of existing family contacts and their relevance to individual welfare assessment. Then I filed a transit corridor inquiry regarding passage options to Davorath, which was a standard document that would sit in the Colonial Transit Authority's inbox for at least a week before anyone looked at it, but which, when eventually examined, would look like the beginning of a legitimate transit arrangement rather than what it actually was, which was me building the record of intent. That was the first of the 12 days. On the 2nd day, Len Durath sent back a message that was longer than I expected and considerably more useful. There was precedent. Not Verath precedent, but close enough. A case from 11 years earlier involving a Kethani individual classified under their species reclamancy system, which functioned similarly to the Keth Voral designation in that it treated certain individuals as communal biological property rather than independent persons. That case had been argued at the Subcolonial Appeals Court on the grounds that the reclamancy classification, while valid under Kethani internal law, had no standing to override colonial civil individual rights protections when the individual was physically present in colonial territory and had not voluntarily entered a contractual arrangement with their species governing body. The appeals court had agreed, narrowly. The ruling had been applied in exactly 2 subsequent cases. She wanted to know if I could hold the window open long enough for her to file a classification challenge at the Colonial Legal Affairs Division on similar grounds. I told her I could hold it for as long as the paperwork would carry it. She told me to hold it as long as I possibly could, and that she was leaving for Veth Carath on the morning transit. I went into the archive room and told Saya that there was a welfare advocate coming and that there was legal precedent, and that the next several days were going to be procedural and slow and possibly frightening, but that I needed her to trust the process. She looked at me steadily. How long have you been doing this? Filing forms, drawing things out, using the procedure. I considered. I have never specifically done this before, I said, but I have spent 31 years learning where the procedural floor is in any given situation. I know this building. I know what it can hold. And when it can't hold anymore. I did not answer that immediately. I had been asking myself the same question since the previous day, in the quiet between the paperwork, when the dread of the answer had a chance to settle. Then we will have made the record, I said, and the record has a life after the case. She looked at me for a moment with those pale eyes. You don't know if it's going to work, she said. No, I said, I don't. She nodded. She went back to sorting documents. I went back to my desk. The third day was quiet. The delegation returned to file a procedural objection to the welfare review timeline, arguing that the Compact's Article 44 protections did not apply to species-classified individuals whose classification predated their entry into colonial territory. I referred the objection to the Colonial Legal Affairs Division and noted in my response that the question of whether a species' internal classification predating colonial entry constituted a valid override of individual welfare protections was precisely the question currently under division review, and that it would therefore be appropriate to await the division's determination before any further action was taken. I stamped the response and filed a copy in triplicate. Oswin came to see me privately that afternoon. He sat in the chair across from my desk that Saya sometimes occupied in the evenings, when I gave her access to the main office after the building was closed to public. He was a man in his late 50s, with the particular tired expression of someone who had spent his career trying to keep 2 kinds of authority from openly colliding, and who was beginning to suspect he was about to fail at it. Tomas, he said, I've known you for 15 years. You have, I said. You're not a troublemaker. I try not to be. The delegation has filed a complaint with the Colonial Administrative Office. They're saying you're deliberately obstructing a legitimate reclamation under the Interspecies Compact. I'm processing a legitimate welfare review under the same compact, I said. Both actions have standing. The procedural order requires the review to complete before the reclamation can proceed. I am following the procedural order. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the office windows, the harbor was going gray with the late afternoon, and the rain had started again, softer now, ticking against the glass. How long can you hold this? He said. Until the Legal Affairs Division responds to my referral. I don't control that timeline. They could take weeks. They could. He looked at me. There's a child in your archive room, Tomas. There is an individual under welfare assessment in my custody, yes. A child, he said again quietly. I met his eyes, yes. He sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. I'm going to have to report what I know to the administrative office, he said, in my official capacity. I understand. Whatever I know as of this moment. He looked at his watch. The administrative office closes at the 17th hour. I'll file my report first thing in the morning. I looked at the clock on the wall above my desk. It read the 14th hour and 40 minutes. Good night, Garrett, I said. Good night, Tomas, he said, and he left. I went into the archive room. Saya was sitting with her back against the third shelf, her knees pulled up, her eyes open. She had heard. "He gave you time," she said. "He gave us 2 hours and 20 minutes, I said. "I'm going to use them." I called Len Durath on the transit line. She was already in the city, had arrived on the morning service, and was working from a rented office space 3 streets over. I told her the administrative office complaint would be filed in the morning, and that once it was, I would have significantly less procedural latitude. She told me what she needed from me before that happened. I spent the next 2 hours producing it. A complete documentation package of the welfare review, the referral to the legal affairs division, the precedent case materials she had sent me, a formal welfare custodian declaration naming Len Durath's organization as Saya's legal welfare representative, and a transit corridor application for passage to Davorath on the 3rd corridor, filed in Saya's name, citing the confirmed existence of a family contact at the destination. I filed all of it before the 16th hour. I filed copies with the Legal Affairs Division, the Subcolonial Appeals Registry, and the Inter-System Welfare Monitoring Office that served as a check on colonial authority compliance with the compact. When I was done, I made 2 cups of tea and brought one into the archive room. Saya was still sitting against the 3rd shelf. She took the mug without comment and wrapped both hands around it. "The document I just filed names Len Durath's organization as your legal welfare representative," I said. "That means any action against your welfare status has to go through her organization legally before it can be executed. It's another layer." "How many layers do we have?" "Fewer than I'd like, but more than we had this morning." She drank her tea. Outside, the rain ticked against the high, narrow window at the top of the archive room wall, the one I had not had fixed in 8 years, the one through which she had come in that first morning. "Tell me about the aunt," I said, "the one in Davorath." She was quiet for a moment. "She's called Vea. She left the conclave before I was born. She lives with a community of unregistered Verath. Conclave law considers her non-compliant, but since she's outside conclave territory, it has no practical authority over her." A pause. "She knows about me. She sent a message 2 years ago. The conclave intercepted it, but I saw enough of it to know she wanted contact." "Does she know you're here?" "No." I nodded. I went back to my desk and added Vea of Davorath, relationship, paternal family contact, confirmed prior communication, to the transit application. Then I sent a message to the Transit Authority's 3rd Corridor Coordination Office asking for confirmation of available passage to Davorath within the next transit cycle. Standard documentation inquiry, nothing more. It would be logged as routine. I did not know if any of it would be fast enough. That was the weight I carried back to my apartment that evening, through the wet cobblestones and the harbor smell and the lit windows of the Karethveth trading district, where the spice merchants were closing up their tarps, and the last of the inter-system freighters was moving out of the harbor channel, its running lights cutting slow lines across the dark water. I walked the whole way thinking about the shape of what we had, and the shape of what was coming, and whether the walls I had built were thick enough or whether they were the kind that looked solid until the moment they stopped being solid. I decided the question was the wrong kind of question. The walls were what I had built. They would hold what they would hold. The 4th and 5th days were spent writing. Len Durath came to the office each morning and worked at the small secondary desk I had cleared for her, filing motions and arguments through the Legal Affairs Division's intake system, while I processed the standard transit documentation that was my actual job, and found ways to route every relevant form through review pathways that added time to the clock. The Colonial Administrative Office had sent a notice that they were reviewing the delegation's complaint. The delegation itself had escalated. They now had a colonial magistrate reviewing their reclamation rights. On the 4th day, I made a discovery that I had not anticipated. The Intercolonial Compact's Article 44 welfare review process required, by Annex 17, that the reviewing officer document in writing any evidence of the individual's capacity for independent preference expression, the bureaucratic term for the ability to want things, to have opinions, to act from something other than instinct or instruction. It was a clause designed to protect species with non-standard cognition from being classified as non-persons by species or authorities who found it convenient to make that argument. I had never invoked it before. I invoked it now. To complete the documentation, I needed to observe Saya and her day-to-day behavior in the archive room and record my observations. I did this with the same precision I brought to everything. I wrote down that she sorted transit forms by date code without being asked and maintained the sorted order across multiple sessions, that she corrected a filing error she noticed in the third shelf's batch from 2 years prior and flagged it to me with a note that identified the source of the error and suggested a cross-reference correction. That when I brought her tea, she moved her sorted papers to make room for the mug and then returned them to precise alignment afterward. That when I asked her opinion on a procedural question, I had asked several, framing them as though I were thinking aloud. She answered with analysis that incorporated variables I had not mentioned, demonstrating that she was modeling the situation independently rather than simply responding to my prompts. I wrote all of this down in formal observation language and filed it as Annex 17 supplemental documentation. It added another procedural layer to the welfare review, and more importantly, it put on record, in the colonial authority's own documentation system, in plain colonial standard, that Sayer of the Varath was a person who sorted things, who noticed errors and fixed them, who thought ahead and made space for other people's mugs of tea. I thought the delegation would never read it, but the record has a life after the case. Someone would read it eventually. On the evening of the 5th day, Saya and I played a tile game I had on my shelf. It was a simple strategy game, based on a children's game from the colonial homeworld, involving a grid of numbered tiles that you place to block your opponent's path. I was not good at it. She was excellent at it, methodical and patient, with the particular precision of someone who had been thinking about document systems and categories and how things fit together since before she could walk. She beat me 4 games straight. The 4th game she finished in 11 moves, which I had not known was possible. "You play the tiles you have," she said, moving her last piece into the position that closed off my final path, "not the ones you want." "I know," I said. "I've been doing that all week." She looked at me across the tile board. In the dim light of the main office, the bioluminescent markings along her jaw were just visible, not bright, not glowing exactly, but present. A faint blue-silver thread that ran from below her ear to the corner of her collarbone and pulsed very slightly when she breathed. I had not looked directly at them before. I looked now. "The conclave documents those," she said, without inflection. "The pattern. They have a catalog of every Kethvoral marking configuration." I did not answer that. There was nothing to add that the silence did not already say. On the 6th day, I received a communication from the Colonial Legal Affairs Division acknowledging receipt of my referral and advising that the question of Kethvoral standing under colonial civil law was under active review and that I would receive a determination within 10 to 15 working days. 10 to 15 working days was longer than we had. But the acknowledgement itself was something, a document, a timestamp, a pending determination, and I filed a copy immediately with the Subcolonial Appeals Registry as evidence that a jurisdictional question remained open. The delegation filed a motion with the colonial magistrate requesting that the pending legal affairs determination be deemed irrelevant to the immediate reclamation proceedings on the grounds that the compact's provisions superseded colonial civil law in interspecies welfare matters. This was a legally arguable position. I spent the 6th evening drafting a counter-response for Len to file, arguing that the supersession provision applied only in cases where colonial civil law and the compact were in direct conflict, whereas in this case the compact itself was silent on the question of species' internal legal categories, meaning colonial civil law applied by default to fill the gap. It was a narrow argument. Len said it was 40% likely to hold. We filed it anyway. On the seventh day, the archive room began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a workspace. Saya had organized the third shelf's entire back section by cross-reference code, a system of her own devising that was, I recognized when I examined it, more efficient than the one I had been using for 31 years. She had also drafted, in her neat, precise hand, a summary of the legal arguments she had heard Len and me discussing, organized by procedural sequence with the key question in each argument identified in the margin. When I found it on the corner of the secondary desk, I stood there for a moment reading it before I understood that she had not done it for my benefit specifically. She had done it because her mind organized things that way, the way a river finds the shortest path to the sea, and that I was simply the person present to see it. I thought about what the conclave saw when they looked at her. I thought about source form and catalog number and pattern classification. I thought about the 41 other individuals in the conclave's records whose names did not appear in the top field of anything. I added the document summary to the Annex 17 observation file. On the evening of the seventh day, we played 2 more rounds of tiles, both of which she won, and at some point I made tea on the small burner and brought her a mug, and she drank it sitting cross-legged with the mug balanced on her knee. Outside, the harbor went from silver to dark, and the freighter lights came fully on, and the cobblestones of the lower district began to reflect the lit windows of the trading houses. How many Keth Vorel are there? Registered, she thought. 42 in conclave records. Unregistered, including my aunt, they don't know. That's why they consider it important to manage the registered ones carefully. 42. I thought about 42 individuals, cataloged and managed, their bodies understood as biological infrastructure rather than as themselves. Saya, I said, what do you want? Not what the conclave wants, not what would be legally optimal. What do you want? She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I was not sure she was going to answer. I want to be unregistered, she said finally. I want to live somewhere that the catalog doesn't reach. I want to not be a pattern they own. She paused. I want to know what my aunt's house looks like. I nodded. I gathered the tiles and put them back in the box. Then that's what we're working toward, I said. On the 8th day, the colonial magistrate ruled. I had known the ruling was coming. Len had warned me. The magistrate's review had been faster than we wanted. The delegation had provided an unusually well-prepared legal brief arguing that the Keth Vorel designation, as a species internal biological legal category, did not require colonial civil recognition to be valid for the purposes of compact-mediated reclamation, and that the individual welfare protections of Article 44 applied only to individuals whose legal personhood was recognized by their own species governing body. Since the conclave explicitly did not recognize Keth Vorel individuals as legal persons, only as source forms under biological custodianship, the Article 44 protections did not apply. The magistrate agreed. She gave me 48 hours to conclude the welfare review and release the individual to delegation custody. I read the ruling at my desk on the morning of the 8th day. Then I set it down and looked at the window above my desk, where the rain was doing its usual work on the glass, and I thought about 48 hours and what was in them. Len came in at the 9th hour. She sat down across from my desk and looked at me across the space where the tile board had been. We file the classification challenge today, she said, at the Subcolonial Appeals Registry. If the court accepts it, we get a temporary stay. How likely is the court to accept it? 40%, she said. Maybe 50 with the precedent documentation you've assembled. It's not a strong case, Tomas. The magistrate's reading of the compact is defensible. What happens if the challenge fails and the stay isn't granted? Then you have 48 hours from the ruling, and we use them to get the transit application approved and Saya on a corridor ship to Davorath. Can we do that in 48 hours? If the transit authority processes it without delay, possibly. If they sit on it, no. I looked at the clock. I looked at the window. File the challenge, I said, and I'll go to the transit authority in person. The transit authority's third corridor office was 12 minutes walk from the registry, through the lower cobblestone district, and up the harbor road to the administrative building that overlooked the freighter terminal. I had been there twice in 31 years, both times to file in-person corrections to misfiled documentation. The corridor coordination officer was a woman named Hess who had been in the role for 9 years and who processed approximately 300 transit applications a week, and who looked at me when I came in, without an appointment, on the morning of the 8th day, with the look of a person who did not have time for whatever this was. I gave her the application file. I gave her the supporting welfare documentation. I gave her the family contact verification and the destination settlement registration for Davorath. I told her, without editorializing, that there was a 48-hour window, and that after that window the individual in question would be transferred to delegation custody, and that the transit opportunity would be closed. She looked at the file. "This is a welfare priority transit application," she said. "Yes. We have a welfare priority processing queue. Standard timeline is 5 to 7 days. I understand. I'm asking whether there is a provision for expedited processing in cases where the welfare situation has a closing deadline." She looked at me. She looked at the file again. She was quiet for a moment. "There is an expedited review provision," she said. "It requires a supervisor authorization and a documentation package demonstrating the time-critical nature of the welfare situation." "I have the documentation package," I said. I had prepared it before I left the office. 31 years of knowing where every procedural door is. She took the package. She told me to come back at the 14th hour. I went back to the registry. I processed the morning standard intake forms. I made tea. I went into the archive room and told Saya what was happening, plainly and without softening it. She listened with the same careful stillness she brought to everything. "The challenge might work," I said. "If the court grants the stay, we have more time. And if it doesn't, then we try to get you on a corridor ship before the 48 hours runs out." She was quiet. She was looking at the transit form I had filed for her, which she had taken from the shelf, and was holding in her hands with the same careful grip she had held the document folder on the first morning. "You put my aunt's name on this," she said. "Mayor of Davorath, yes." "You've never met her?" "No." She turned the form over in her hands. "The conclave would say this document has no legal standing, that I have no legal personhood to be named in a transit application. The conclave's view of your legal personhood is precisely what Lendurath is contesting at the subcolonial appeals registry as of this morning," I said. She looked at the form, then she looked up at me. "You put my name first," she said. "At the top. You wrote it in the top field before anything else." "That's where the individual's name goes," I said. "First field, standard procedure." She held the form for another moment. Then she set it back on the shelf, carefully, in the space she had cleared for it between 2 date-coded transit batches from the previous quarter. I went back to my desk. At the 14th hour, I went back to the transit authority. Hess met me at the counter with a supervisor-authorized expedited review form and a processing confirmation. The application was in the priority queue. She could not guarantee a transit assignment before the end of the following day, but she had flagged it for same-day processing if a corridor berth was available in the morning departure schedule. I thanked her. I walked back through the harbor district in the thin rain, watching the freighters in the terminal, thinking about which ones might be heading for the third corridor and how long the crossing took, and whether Vea of Davorath would get the message I had already sent through the inter-settlement communication relay, the one that said only, "Your niece may be coming." The challenge failed. Len told me at the 17th hour. The court had declined to grant a temporary stay, finding that the magistrate's ruling was within the permissible interpretation of the compact. The 48-hour clock, which had begun at the 9th hour that morning, was running. I sat at my desk for a while after Len left. The office was quiet. The rain had stopped finally, and the harbor was doing the thing it does in the evening after rain, where the water goes silver and still, and the freighter lights begin to show. I could see a strip of it from the office window if I sat at a particular angle, which I almost never did because there was too much else to look at on the desk. I went into the archive room. Saya was sitting against the third shelf. She knew. I could see it in the way she was sitting, not frightened, not collapsed, but gathered in some internal way, as if she had been preparing for this particular gravity and was now simply carrying it. "The challenge failed," I said. "Yes. We have until the 9th hour tomorrow morning. The transit authority may have a corridor berth by then. If they do, we have a case for a welfare transit authorization that supersedes the reclamation order by approximately 3 hours. 3 hours, she said. It's not a large window. No. I sat down on the floor across from her. My knees were not as good as they had been 10 years ago, and the archive room floor was cold, but I sat down anyway because she was on the floor, and I did not want to be the person standing over this conversation. "If the transit doesn't come through," I said, "you go with the delegation in the morning, but Len is filing a species rights challenge at the Intercolonial Tribunal today. If it's accepted, the tribunal can issue a temporary injunction that would require the delegation to hold you in colonial territory pending the hearing. That's a longer process but a more powerful one. The precedent we've built this week, everything I've filed, everything Len has filed, that's the foundation of the tribunal case. It doesn't disappear if the delegation takes you tomorrow." She looked at me for a long time. "You're telling me this might take longer than 12 days, she said. "Yes. That you might not see the end of it." "I might not," I said. "The obstruction complaint is going to result in consequences for me once the 48 hours runs out and the administrative office sees the full picture. I've known that since the 4th day." She was quiet. She was looking at the transit form on the shelf. "You did it anyway," she said. "You were in my archive room," I said. "You had nowhere else to go. You told me your name." I could hear the harbor through the high window. I could hear the sound of a freighter moving in the channel, the low engines that carry a long way in the quiet after rain. "Will you tell me something?" she said. "If I can." "What did you think," she said slowly, "when you first saw me, when you first came into the archive room and saw what I was, what I looked like?" She touched the marking along her jaw briefly, a small, unconscious gesture, "before you knew anything else." I thought about that first morning, the flickering light, the pale child behind the third shelf with a document folder held over her face. "I thought," I said, "that you had been awake all night and that you needed water." She looked at me. Something shifted in her face, not breaking, not softening exactly, but settling, like a thing that has been held under pressure for a long time, finding, briefly, that the pressure is off. "That's all," she said. "That was the immediate thing," I said. And then I thought, here is someone who is frightened and hiding and who got into my archive room through the broken window latch and who is, by any reasonable standard, a child, and who needs someone to not make the situation worse before they've had a chance to think. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You wrote my name in the top field." "First field, standard procedure." "Nobody has ever done that," she said, very quietly. "Put my name where the individual's name goes. The conclave forms have a catalog number in that field." They have the Keth Voral designation. They have the pattern classification. She looked at the transit form on the shelf. They don't have my name. I did not say anything. There was nothing to add to it. We stayed in the archive room for a while after that, not talking much. I had brought the tile game in and we played 2 more rounds, both of which she won, and at some point I made tea on the small burner and brought her a mug, and she drank it sitting cross-legged with the mug balanced on her knee. Outside, the harbor went from silver to dark, and the freighter lights came fully on, and the cobblestones of the lower district began to reflect the lit windows of the trading houses. The conclave documents those, she said, without inflection. The pattern, they have a catalog of every Keth Voral marking configuration. The last of the documentation she needed for the tribunal filing. I had been working on it in pieces all week. I sent it in one complete package with a cover note that said, "Everything is here. Do what you can with it." She sent back a single word, "Received." I stayed at the desk until after midnight, reading through the procedural record of the previous 12 days, making sure every form was properly cross-referenced, every filing complete, every timestamp accurate. It was meticulous work and unnecessary in one sense. The record was already filed, already stamped, already in the systems of 4 different colonial offices. But I did it anyway because 31 years had taught me that a complete record is its own kind of argument, and because I needed to be doing something with my hands. The transit authority sent a message at the 3rd hour of the morning. There was a corridor berth. A freighter called the Orvath Line hauler Karen's Reach, departing the Veth Kareth terminal at the 7th hour on the 3rd corridor route, with a connection point at the Davoreth settlement relay. The welfare priority transit assignment had been confirmed. I sat looking at the message for a moment. Then I went into the archive room. She was asleep. I had not seen her sleep before. She was curled on her side against the 3rd shelf, her head on the folded jacket she had been using as a pillow all week, her hands tucked under her chin. The bioluminescent markings were faint and slow in sleep, barely visible, just a suggestion of blue-silver in the dark. I sat down by the door of the archive room and waited. She woke at the 4th hour the way she always woke, all at once, no slow surfacing, eyes open and alert. "There's a berth," I said, "the Karen's Reach, 7th hour." She looked at me. She looked at the window where the first gray of dawn was beginning to come through. "The delegation will come at the 9th hour," she said. "Yes, the berth is at the 7th hour. We have a welfare transit authorization that supersedes the reclamation order by approximately 2 hours. She was quiet. She sat up and took the folded jacket from under her head and put it on. "And you," she said. "I'll be here," I said. "When the delegation comes." "Yes." She looked at me steadily. "They'll hold you responsible." "Yes." "The obstruction complaint, the administrative review." She was precise about it, cataloging the consequences the way she cataloged documents, because she had grown up understanding that systems have consequences and they fall on people. "Yes," I said. She pulled on her boots. The left toe was still worn through. "You should come with me," she said, "on the Karen's Reach." I shook my head. "The authorization is in your name, single transit, and someone needs to be here when the delegation arrives, or they'll escalate the situation before Len can get the tribunal filing submitted." She looked at her boots for a moment. "You're going to stand in the doorway," she said, "when they come." "I'm going to be where I'm supposed to be," I said, "at my desk in my office doing my job." She looked up at me. I had one more thing to do before the 7th hour. I went to my desk and pulled a standard individual intake form from the left drawer. I uncapped my pen and I wrote in the top field her name, Saya. Then I completed the form fully: transit destination Davoreth, welfare representative Lendurath's organization, family contact Vea of Davoreth, current welfare status cleared for transit under expedited authorization reference number, and I wrote the number. I stamped it and signed it and made 3 copies, one for her to carry, one for the archive, one for the transit officer at the terminal. I gave her the copy and the transit authorization printout, and the small cloth bag I had packed the previous evening, with the things I thought she might need for a 2-day corridor crossing. She took them. She looked at the form one more time. "Top field," she said. "Top field," I said. "Standard procedure." She put the form in the inside pocket of the jacket, close to her chest. Then she looked at me across the desk that had been between us for 12 days, across the intake ledger and the cold tea and the stamp, and the 31 years of knowing where every procedural door is. "Thank you, Tomas Vrel," she said. "Safe passage, Saya," I said. I walked her to the side window of the archive room, the one with the loose latch, the one I had not had fixed in 8 years. I opened it for her. The morning air came in, cold and salt, and the smell of the harbor in the early light, the freighters already moving in the channel, the cobblestones of the lower district going from gray to gold as the sun began to clear the port district rooftops. She went through the window without difficulty. She was small and she was quick, and she knew exactly how to move through a space without making anything harder than it needed to be. She did not look back. I had not expected her to. She went down the side alley toward the harbor road, her boots quiet on the wet stone, the jacket collar up, one hand pressed to the inside pocket where the transit form was. I closed the window. I went to my desk. I made tea. I opened the intake ledger for the day. The delegation arrived at the 9th hour, as I had known they would. They had a colonial enforcement officer with them this time, in addition to Oswin, who stood to one side with the look of a man who had made his peace with something difficult. I was at my desk. My hands were flat on the surface of the desk, on either side of the intake ledger. The senior retrieval officer told me the review period had concluded, and the reclamation order was in effect, and that I was required to produce the individual. I told her the individual had departed on the 7th hour corridor transit under a welfare priority authorization, reference number, and I gave her the number. There was a moment of silence. Then there was considerably more than silence. I will not detail all of what followed. It was, in the procedural sense, complicated, and in the personal sense, unpleasant, and in the ultimate sense, exactly what I had known it would be. The colonial enforcement officer placed me in custody at the 14th hour, citing obstruction of a valid compact reclamation order. I was taken to the municipal detention block and processed, which took most of the afternoon. In the processing room before they took my effects, I asked to send one message. They allowed me 2 minutes on the communication terminal. I sent the message to Len Durath. It said, "She is on the Karen's reach. File the tribunal challenge. The record is complete." She replied in 40 seconds. She replied, "Already filed, stay steady." They gave me a cell in the detention block with a bunk and a narrow shelf above it. I put my folded jacket on the bunk and sat down and looked at the wall and thought about the 7th hour and the harbor and the small boots quiet on the wet cobblestones. I thought about the transit form in the inside pocket of the jacket, close to her chest, her name in the top field. I thought about Vaya of Davorath, who had received a message that said only, "Your niece may be coming." 3 weeks later, Len Durath came to see me in the visiting room through the wire partition. She had a small notebook in her coat pocket, and she wrote down what I told her. At the end, she told me the tribunal had issued a temporary injunction requiring the delegation to hold Saya in colonial territory pending a hearing. The injunction had been filed and served. "Does it reach her in time?" I asked. "We don't know yet," she said. "The delegation has contested service." I nodded. "The species rights challenge is solid, Tomas," she said. "The record you built, 12 days of procedural documentation, every filing complete, every annex cited, it's the foundation of the strongest Keth-Voral challenge anyone has brought to the tribunal. It changes the shape of the argument." I know, I said. I did know. That was why I had done it that way. From the beginning, even before I was sure what the beginning was building toward. Len left. The guard brought me back to my cell. I sat on the bunk and looked at the narrow shelf above it. There was nothing on it yet. I thought that when the tribunal ruling came, whenever it came, however it went, I would put the notification on that shelf. It seemed like the right place. The window in my cell was small and high, and through it, if I stood on the bunk, I could see a strip of sky above the rooftops of Veth Karath. Gray in the way of the wet season. The harbor smell reached even here, faint but present, salt and engine oil, and the particular sweetness of inter-system coolant lines. I had no rank. I had never had rank. I had a stamp and a filing code and 31 years of knowing where the procedural doors were. I had put her name in the top field. That was all she had asked me to do, in the end. To see her the way a form is supposed to be completed, correctly, with the individual's name in the place where it belongs. I had done that. Whatever came next, I had done that. I got down from the bunk and put my hands flat on my knees and looked at the strip of sky through the high window and waited for the morning.